So I think we can begin. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today, this afternoon, to celebrate the life and work of the great man and great Irish psychiatrist, Dr. Ivor Browne. Um, my name is Rob O'Cofig. I'm a psychotherapist in Ireland. I'm a of Inward Bound psilocybin retreats in the Netherlands. And I'm joined today by Martin Duffy of Dundee Park, the Irish Centre for Shamanic Studies and Transpersonal Studies, a world expert on Celtic shamanism and transpersonal psychology, who works with Ivor for many years in the Irish Psychiatric Services. So it's a real privilege to be joined here today to celebrate this really great man who the purpose of the call today really is to celebrate his work and, you know, to honor who was a really, truly great man. So thanks, Martin. Thanks for joining us today.
Very welcome, Rob. It's great to be here. It's great to be here with you. You know, we have a long history together as well, and we understand each other's work, and delighted to be doing this with you, particularly to honor Ivor's memory and, you know, talk about a man who was quite, you know, innovative and creative and revolutionary in his thinking and did a lot of service for this country and for the psychiatric establishment here.
Thank you. Yeah. So beautiful. So we're going to go through a few things on this call today, just to give a rough overview of what we're going to talk about. So we'll talk about his early years in psychiatry in Ireland, his pioneering work with LSD psychotherapy in the 60s, then holotropic breathwork and ketamine-assisted therapy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, his work on social psychiatry, especially then his work on trauma and the frozen present, the wisdom of the heart and the importance of music, and then offer some space and time at the end for Q&A. So I hope we can do justice to the great man's work, but we'll see where we go anyway with this and let it flow. And thanks to everyone for joining. I know there's some really amazing people on this call, and you're all thank you for your time. So maybe you can start, Martin, by telling us when you first met Ivor.
Yeah, I began nursing in 1977 in St. Albans Hospital in Monaghan, and back then, you know, the whole psychiatric service was very archaic. You know, it wasn't long since the nurses had been called keepers, 40 patients to a ward. And I had gone into that situation thinking naively that I was going to be doing kind of psychotherapy or work with people with mental health problems. And during my training as a student nurse, you know, Ivor Browne's name would come up every now and then, but in general, not in a positive sense, in the way that they spoke about him, the psychiatrist and the consultant psychiatrist, whatever, because he was seen as a maverick. He was seen as somebody that wasn't, you know, playing ball with the biomedical system, and was controversial in that regard. So I became dissatisfied very quickly with the services and the way things were run in those hospitals. Like there was 1,200 patients in a hospital all crowding together, that kind of thing. So I started looking outside psychiatric nursing for the ways of working. So I started training in counseling, psychotherapy. And it was during my training in the Dundalk Counseling Centre with Jim O'Donoghue that I first really heard about Ivor's work from another perspective. I'd come across Dan Groff's work, and after reading Realms of the Human Unconscious, blew my mind. And then part of our training as counsellors in Dundalk Counselling Centre was doing Frank Lake's work at the time. It was kind of primal therapy. You know, the work that was going on there was quite innovative and ahead of its time in that sense. And Jim O'Donoghue knew Ivor well, so we were all sort of bussed up to St. Brendan's one weekend, a Friday evening, to do what we called holotropic breathwork, or so it was called, in St. Brendan's Hospital in the church. And we landed there, and you know, actually we had some experience of doing the work, but this was a far more intense setup. Ivor had the whole place rigged up with proper sound equipment, and you know, he had he had been doing this work for some time, and so we got into doing the work there. So that's where I first met Ivor. It was a powerful encounter because he was facilitating the work, and I'll say more about that later on. But that was my first encounter with him, and then, you know, later on I ended up working with him in the church and in St. Brendan's on different occasions. But I was very from the very beginning, I was always but this was a huge difference in experience for me, in the sense of, you know, working with a psychiatrist, and not only a psychiatrist but a professor of psychiatry, who was talking about therapy, who was talking about, you know, the patients in another way. He had a compassion about him, and a sense of real care. And this was mind-blowing for me, because I mean, my experience of psychiatrists up until then was very biomedically orientated, all about medicines, and so it opened me up to another way of seeing things. And this, it was only after I met Stan Groff, who also a psychiatrist, I realized that not all psychiatrists were the same in terms of following the biomedical model. So Ivors, my friendship and relationship with Ivor developed from then on in.
Amazing. And what sort of year was that? Just to give us context. What year was that?
That was 1986, 87. Yeah, around 87, I think, was my first meeting with him in the church at that time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we'll go back to his early years, because, you know, he was a product of the 1950s, and we can hardly imagine the Ireland that, you know, he was graduated from medical school in 1954, where he was told that he wasn't a great student, that he was only fit to be an obstetrician or a psychiatrist. So he seemed to have a very, not low self-esteem, but he was a humble man. He didn't have this sense of being anything special.
Yeah,
that's my
he
sense.
Was quite a humble. Yeah, he was quite a humble man, and very little ego, in the sense, and he said it himself. Like he called himself a slow learner. He was kind of dyslexic. I think when he was at school, he was left-handed, and they made him write with his right hand, and kind of traumatized him in that regard, that he was this kind of slow reader, as he said, and fell behind at school. But it was that other side of, see, Ivor was a Pisces. So, you know, Piscean people are very Neptunian. And I always had that sense of him, that he, you know, the Neptunian Piscean types are otherworldly. They, amongst the most spiritual people I've met, you know, that have that sense of, you know, swimming the two fishes, one in the other world and one in this world. And Ivor was very like that. He was very humble, very compassionate, very caring. But it was always like there was a part of him, you know, looking with one eye into this world and another eye into the other world. And he, you know, didn't give himself enough credit, I don't think, at times, for the amazing person he was, and the incredible work that he was doing.
Yeah, and of course he had TB. He was a jazz musician. He that's really what he loved to do. But he got TB, and then he couldn't play the sax anymore. But that sense of musicianship was a deep part of his life, right? And being kind of an outsider from early on. If you read his book,
Yes.
his biography. So I'll just play a short clip here from the beautiful film Meetings with Ivor, which gives a sense of the man for those who never met him.
The truth is, there is no therapy. There is nothing I can do to you that changes you.
Ivor Browne.
It's Ivor Browne. Sure, everyone knows that fucker is nuts.
So maybe it's time to give up.
Yeah, people keep telling me that.
Now, none of this is exactly mainstream psychiatry.
I can provide a context of safety, but they have to face the pain.
And love it hurt for me.
I miss her so much. I have participated in most of the awful things of psychiatry. They would drill 2 burr holes here, put a knife in and completely sever the frontal lobes.
What have I to be ashamed of? Almost everything.
Something about him made me sort of like want to really try.
Since the 60s, there's been an advancing tide of research on the heart, which is turning out to be vastly more than just a pump.
I think if I had the 2 words to describe his overarching vision of how he would like to see the world, those would be the two words that I would use. I would use duty and love.
If you met Ivor Browne, you'd think he was a total madman, but you know, there's more to him than that.
There's change coming.
So for me, what comes through so powerfully there is this, the Ireland he was working in the 50s and 60s, and this, you know, Grange Gorman and these places where lobotomies were still being performed. It's very hard these days to kind of get our head around that. But you came in at the tail end of that, right? You experienced that, or probably the end of it.
Yeah, I did. In 77, I mean, you know, not only lobotomies, I nursed patients who had lobotomies. They were still rarely being used, but they were using radioactive isotopes at the time. They were drilling holes in and putting these radioactive isotopes in instead of chopping the brains, as Ivor called it. But I nursed patients who had been through the chopping process, and you know, they were usually confined to the back wards of the hospital, usually vegetables in a vegetative state. They were non-functioning in a lot of ways, just physically there. They needed a lot of full nursing care. And really, what I saw in the history that I got from the senior staff who had been there when those processes were going on was that lobotomies were used for management problems. If a patient was in somehow showing any kind of difficulties, inverted commas, on the ward, they were sent off for these lobotomies in order to calm them down or to make them more manageable or whatever. And, you know, essentially, you know, from my perspective, what I saw was massive soul loss. It was like expelling the soul from the person, and they were left in a state where something had been lost. It was like the connection to spirit, the like connection to soul, the connection to themselves was gone. And I remember one particular man I nursed, Paddy, and it's like, and this is what Ivor talked about later on in his work too, about, you know, schizophrenia. You know, that, you know, and I love the way he put it, that, you know, this was a retreating from the world because these people were so sensitive, and that the world impacted them. I call them the highly sensitive people, and they retreated inwards. And this guy Paddy, he had had a lobotomy, and, you know, I just had this feeling about this man. He had something very special aura, and I just sit with him every day. And the other senior staff said, "Don't know what you're sitting with Paddy for. He never talks." He hadn't spoken in years. And eventually, one day, after about 3 to 6 months, I'm sitting there, and he started speaking to me, and we went on to develop an amazing relationship with him, because he'd been fishing, you know, he'd hunting rabbits. Eventually, I used to take him out, and take him out on my days off. But that showed me something really important in terms of what Ivor had been talking about, that, you know, these people had retreated into themselves because the world was too harsh and too hard for them. And there were very fine, sensitive spirits that had incarnated in here, some of them with a mission and some of them with a purpose that wasn't understanding our culture or society. Ivor saw that. He understood that. He reached into that. And it was through his encouragement. And, you know, the way, as I say, I was in awe of the man in the early days, given the fact that he was a professor of psychiatry. I was a lowly psychiatric nurse in the system. But to see somebody like Ivor, you know, have a spiritual sense of the person and actually care about what went on for them, well, had a huge influence on me.
Beautiful. And I have a feeling those early years in Grange Gorman and seeing all that really affected Ivor. I think it in some way haunted him, maybe, you know, where this, what he saw in those early days of psychiatry.
Yeah, and it was haunting. I mean,
yeah,
you know, when my first encounter with psychiatric services, you know, seeing those people locked up in those wards, you know, I remember it was October 77, you know, and I first went down on the Sunday night. I was starting nursing the next day, and I had been given a room by one of the staffs who was on night duty, and it was off Ward 7, which was a ward that was for the chronic cases. All the patients were lumped in together. mentally handicapped, Down syndrome, physical and mental disabilities. And I remember that night looking in through the window of the door into this ward, and I just saw bedlam. And I said, "That's it. I'm fucking out of here. I mean, I'm not going back in. I'm not staying here." I remember the next morning at breakfast, the guy who'd given me his room said, "Listen, hang in now. You're going into college for 2 weeks. They're going to pay you while you're there. You've left your job in Dundalk. You're here now. Hang on for the 2 weeks." So I did. And what saved the day for me was I just had this thirst for knowledge all my life. And I'm in class and we're learning about anatomy and physiology and psychology and psychiatry. So I stayed for the 2 weeks, and then we were out on the wards. And once I got used to, what was a complete strange environment for me, I'd never seen anything like this before. I never did get used to it, but I did begin to create, form relationships with some of so-called, I don't like the word patient. I just want to state that up front, the persons, the people. Then I felt it was part of something that I had to do. I had to stay there. But Ivor's experience would have been a lot worse, because that was the beginnings of change within the psychiatric system. Planning for the Future came out in 1984, which was about moving people out into the community. But in Ivor's time, it was very much, the locked up institution where a lot of people, to be quite honest with you, were dumped by society, families, and by this and by the situation. Yeah, these were where we hid these people away from our society behind the walls and the doors of these institutions.
Yes, so psychiatry was used as a form of social control for many years. So in Ireland in particular, and of course he was friends with Ronnie Lang, the famous psychiatrist who spoke a lot about that. But I'd like to address now the early days of LSD psychotherapy, which is really extraordinary, because he went off to Harvard University. Well, he was working in England first with Joshua Beer, who was pretty much the pioneer of social psychiatry in the UK, very great man. And in 1960, they co-authored this paper, an experiment with the Psychiatric Night Hospital on the therapeutic use of LSD. Now, what's really extraordinary to me about this, he published this in 1960. So Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert began working with LSD in 1960. Ivor Browne was predating this. He published this paper. It's a really extraordinary paper because he speaks about the use of set and setting, the use of group psychotherapy. He speaks of things that are really, almost 60, 70 years later, that are still cutting edge, you could say. So just a few quotes from this I'd like to address. So 3 nights a week, we would have a group in which we would give LSD to patients who would stay overnight. I have to say I saw people manifest remarkable experience and undergo radical change. At the time, there was no clear understanding of the relation between some atypical psychotic states and early trauma. So retrospectively, I don't think we understood very clearly at that time what we were doing, even though I saw a number of people who had been chronically disturbed for years totally transformed while I was there. LSD acts as a strong disinhibiting factor, revealing material and traumata that have been deeply buried for a long time. And that the second function of LSD is that it helps to produce an unusually intensive, intimate, and well-knit group environment. So here he was speaking of Stan Grof's non-specific amplifier of the unconscious, years before more or less the same time Grof's early work in Europe. And one last quote. The first problem is how LSD performs its alleged therapeutic role. It is obvious that the drug is a deep-seated abreactive agent, i.e. able to produce the discharge of repressed experiences with an appropriate emotional response. The setting in which this response occurred may be the central reason for any alleged therapeutic value, the core being the relationship between the patient, the therapist, and his assistants. So he's speaking here of the therapeutic relationship, the importance of it. He's speaking of the set and setting. He's speaking of the cathartic states that arise through psychedelic use, very early on in the field. I find it really extraordinary, almost, that this has almost been written out of psychedelic history. You don't hear people talk about Ivor Browne in this regard. And then of course he went to San Francisco in 1959, I think, and the story goes that he was one of the people who brought psilocybin to California, right?
That's right. You know, for a so-called slow learner, Ivor was way ahead of his time. I mean, you're a very intelligent man. He had studied Freud and, you know, Jung and the early psychoanalysts, Otto Rank, Wilhelm Reich. He knew that work intimately. But he had this knack and talent for making it his own and synthesizing it into his own way of thinking. And as you say, from way back, he had, you know, as he went to the UK first, I think he was fortunate at that time. He met an old psychoanalyst, as he would say, in the hospital. They were working with ex-veterans from the wars in these places in Cambridge or Oxford, I think it was. And you know, this was a revelation for him, because he had this sense that, you know, as this old analyst had said to him, you need to think for yourself. He'd come from an Ireland where you don't think for yourself. It was the norm. You follow the norms, you follow the dictates of the church, the political system, the social norms. Very repressed country back in the days, this country was. And then Ivor then was fortunate and it was almost synchronistic the way these people were introduced into his life, like Breer and others, and that he could work with LSD in the early days. As you say, around the same time as Stan Grof was working with in 1956, 57, 58 in Czechoslovakia and Prague. But it's like they were working in tandem and discovering the same things and having the same kind of realizations. And I think, you know, coming to the same conclusions very much so. But it's interesting, it also in the differences in the approach. Ivor's approach was always that kind of heartfelt approach about care, compassion, group therapy, that kind of thing. Stan Grof's also would be the same, but Stan would have been more intellectually interested in the process. And like, I think Stan's contribution to the work is his writings and his intellectual understandings. And as many would say, Grof's work is a follow-on, like you have Freud, Jung, Grof. But as you say, Ivor is written out of that history in the sense that his work, not only did he discover what the others did, but he brought in this whole idea of social psychiatry and the community. I mean, his early innovations in the clinics out in Ballyfermot, you know, social psychiatry with Michael Curry. And, you know, I suppose he got sidelined in that sense. He didn't spend as much time academically writing papers or books like the others did. He was more at the coalface. He was more out there doing the work, if you know what I mean, in a very real way. Because of his compassion for the people, he got involved. And I know later on in his life, he did say, if he'd do it all again, what he might have done was created a psychotherapeutic psychiatric community based around his model and his teachings, and, you know, have, you know, places for people to come to stay and work and learn or whatever. But I think what happened to Ivor in terms of him being written out of history is when he came back to Ireland, he saw how critical things were here in the psychiatric service and the whole medical establishment. And he just rolled up his sleeves and got stuck in. And, you know, while others, you know, had pursued a more academic kind of career.
Yeah. So, which is why it's so important, I think, to tell these stories, because it's he's such an important figure. So I'd like to move on now to the holotropic breathwork. Of course, he and his relationship with Grof. So I'll play a brief clip here because I think it's incredible. This early days of breathwork, which of course has become so well known in the past few years now. But this is 1989 in Dublin, and I just love this clip because it shows some of the reactions he got, I suppose, in a way. That's.
Well, first thing I want to do is welcome everybody. Today we're having what I would call a creative workshop. This method we're also using for therapy, but I think it has a wider application, and the man who actually developed this method, which is called holotropic therapy, Stan Grof, is using it more in terms of either training or for people to gain special experiences. So today what I think we want to try and look at is see, can you open up your own creativity? Now, the essence of what we're doing is to achieve an altered state of consciousness, if you like, to enter the dream world. And to do that, there are many roads into that pathway: hypnosis, various kinds of psychedelic substances and so on. But today what we're using is breathing, that's forced hyperventilation, and also music. The purpose of music really is more as a background. You're not here to be specifically listening to music. You're here to go into your own experience. The whole thing is to go down into your own inner experience. If you like, it's an inner journey. And it's very difficult to let go of the ordinary 9 to 5 type consciousness. So the breathing we can serve two parts. One is that it does disturb the biochemistry of the brain, but also if you think only of the breathing, it tends to stop you thinking of anything else. So what I would ask you is to just concentrate on breathing as heavily and quickly as you possibly can. Try not to be concerned with anything else. You're not going in to try and achieve anything. You're not trying to say, oh, I want to get this experience or that experience, because anything like that can interfere. It's to distract yourself from any direction, to in other words, to let go. So the best way, as I say, is to be preoccupied with the breathing. And essentially, you just keep breathing until you're not aware that you're breathing. There are 4 phases, if you like, just a little bit of relaxation at the beginning, then getting into the breathing phase, and we tend to play disturbing music or sounds for that to help create the atmosphere. Then a sort of spacey period where you're well into the experience and spacey type of music. And then in the last period, very gentle, peaceful music, so the people come out nice and smoothly and peacefully out of the reaction. We're doing this, actually recording it, because we want to try and study the process. So if you like, it's a study workshop, but I think it's an opportunity for all of you to enter the deeper part yourself and to see how this helps to relieve or release creativity.
Close the eyes. And I would like just to breathe in and out deeply and slowly. Take in the breath, try to bring air and oxygen to every part of the body.
So what sort of reactions did he get in those early years? So he was working with LSD until the 80s in Ireland. Then he began working more with holotropic breathwork and ketamine. So
yeah,
it must have been
that was amazing. I mean, I was involved with him at that time. I mean, in fact, I was at that particular workshop. I remember it being filmed. Because he not only worked with the inpatient psychiatric patients in the hospital, those workshops there and others, he ran for artists, actors, and creative people from around Dublin. A lot of people who are well known, including, and I can say his name, Colm Tóibín, because he's written about this. I remember Colm Tóibín being there at that workshop, and June Levine, Ivors' wife. And he was using this work to help people uncover any emotional or traumatic experiences that were lodged within their psyches with the unexperienced experience, the frozen past, to free them up to be more creative, painters, artists, that kind of thing. But also, he was using this method with the inpatients in St. Brendan's Hospital at the time. And I was fortunate enough, I was a community mental nurse, a community mental health nurse by this time, which means I worked in the community out here in County Meath. And my chief nursing officer, fortunately, was quite awake and open to him. So I was given permission to go up to those sessions every Wednesday and help run them with Ivor. This was for the inpatients. So, and also brought some of the patients I work with in County Meath up to those sessions. Now, we saw remarkable things happen. I mean, Ivor said it, and it's true. The wards were emptied of people who were, some of them locked up, because we would bring them into those sessions, do full catharsis with them, with holotropic breathwork. But Ivor was also using ketamine at the time. I mean, my first experience with Ivor in those early days when I was his workshop was taking ketamine there that he had offered me as part of the experience, which again was a complete game changer for me. That was my first introduction to the power of psychedelic therapy being held in a safe environment and going through the deeper catharsis for people. So Ivor always said, you asked the question about what do people think about it. He said, of all the things that could have got me on, could have been at the work in the church, but it's like it was protected in some way. He never got any trouble about that, and it was openly done, the work was done. But the results, I suppose, is what mattered, because people were getting better. They were recovering from long-term psychiatric situations. They were having the coax systems were being activated. They were re-experiencing the birth processes. They were having transpersonal spiritual experiences. They were going through child sexual abuse issues, all stuff that was lodged in their psyche. And here's where Ivor's genius came in. He understood that the problem in psychiatry was that somebody who was presenting with, particular depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar, whatever, that there was an underlying cause for this. And this is where the Unexperienced Experience Frozen Past paper that he wrote really was genius. And what he understood was that when you went into the psychiatric system, you were medicated. And not only was the frozen past, but then you were frozen in the frozen past by the medication and the drugs. And if you got to the person in time and you held a compassionate, caring, loving space for them, and you allowed them to drop right into what was going on for them and cathartic it, release it, and using body work as we do in holotropic breath work, the music is there to, activate the experience. And then, there was an initial kind of catharsis thing, and then you create a safe space for the person while they're going through that. But that was a real eye-opener for me, because later when I went on to train with Stan Groff and holotropic breathwork, Stan was very impressed by this, because he had, worked with LSD, say, in Prague back in the day before it was banned, and had some experience of this. But there was nowhere else in the world at that time doing the work that Ivor was doing in the church in the way he was doing it.
I think that's definitely fair to say. I think in Switzerland there was one-to-one LSD therapy going on through this period, but I'm pretty sure there was no one else in the world working legally with group therapy with either ketamine or LSD in the way that Ivor was, which is extraordinary. It wasn't happening in the States. It wasn't happening in the UK. So really he was a pioneer in the world of this. And I'm hearing what you're saying, like I'm knowing through the work I do in Holland with psilocybin how challenging these spaces can be to hold. He must have been an incredibly strong man, and you too, to hold these spaces with people with really serious psychiatric issues week in, week out. Those sessions must have been really intense.
Oh, you bet your life on it. They were very intense, because like we were working with every kind of situation. Like, I mean, I remember one particular session that some of them we held one-to-one, because they were that intense. It was just myself and Ivor and one other psychologist, and maybe the nurse he worked with, Stephanie, at the time. And we do one-to-one sessions, and they would go all over the place. Like, I remember one woman we worked with who had been in a nun, and she went through all sorts of powerful experiences, including, I have to be honest with you, what I saw, which is described in Stan Groff's book, it was like a full-blown exorcism using ketamine, and she regressed back to some sort of thing, inside of her, and then her birth trauma. Then she went back to past lives, and over a period, and this woman was locked up. I mean, some of the patients that I work with Ivor, they were locked in locked wards. I'd go down to do the after sessions with them sometimes, and I have to, the usual psychiatrism, the keys, all you hear the jangle of keys going through doors down to where the patient was, because Ivor was very keen and so I'm very proud. There was always follow-up therapy done with the patients. So I would come in after the Wednesday sessions and at the weekends and do regular psychotherapy as integration work with these so-called patients. And I saw situations evolve where patients locked up over a period of 6 weeks, 6 sessions, culminating in very powerful, intense catharsis, being discharged from the hospital. The patient I work with from County Meath, a young woman who was traumatized beyond belief, really losing it to multiple suicide attempts. And I used to meet her there. In every Wednesday we did the work with her. And eventually she got discharged. I didn't hear anything from her about her for a long time, because she went off about her life. And years later, I'm in Trim here in County Meath, where she came from, and I got this tap on the shoulder, and there she was. And she said to me, I'm living in England now. I have a husband and 2 kids, and I have a regular, normal life. And she says, only for Ivor Browne and you and the work that we did in that church, I would never have made it. I'd either have killed myself or I would have been locked up in the institution for life. Now, that's only one story of many that I witnessed, and Ivor has many more stories because he did a lot more work than I did with him. And that was the power of the man he was in terms of his knowledge, his information, and his compassion, the way he held those sessions for people.
Incredible. I'm just feeling how courageous he must have been, because how did he get away with it in a conservative Ireland where, you know, these things were not, you know, Ireland in the 80s was a very different place, 70s before.
Absolutely.
How did he get away with it? The courage he must have had to continue doing this work, I guess, against a lot of opposition. What's your feeling on that?
Huge opposition. Oh yeah, huge opposition. I mean, you know, from from the church, from the political system, from the health boards, because he was a maverick, he was radical, he was pushing it out there. But you see, there was something in Ivor that drove him, that was beyond any care for his own self-preservation or whatever. And you know, it was like a spiritual impulse. It was like a desire to make a difference here on this planet for the time he was here. And that took precedence. Like, he got himself into all sorts of scrapes and situations because, you know, anybody else would be thinking of the career or thinking of, you know, what the press is going to say. I mean, there was a big furore one time. He did give a talk at the Students' Union in Dublin, and he talked about having had some experiences himself with LSD and the positive effects in it. And there was some reporter there at the time, and it got splashed all over the newspapers the next day, and there was hell to pay for it. Like, I mean, he almost lost his job on several occasions because of the way he was and the chances that thing. And it's like, again, it's almost like, and he said it himself, he said it was almost like he was protected by something beyond himself, something in the transpersonal realms, you know, felt that this man was here to do a job and he had to be looked after. And he had the courage to go forward. But as I say, he always put the other person first. He always rolled up his sleeves. Like, he took calls at home. He went out on calls at weekends. He just had this tremendous impulse to help others. And when you look at his early life, I suppose you can see that he was a wounded healer. He had suffered himself. He'd gone through many dismemberment processes as a child. In a way, you know, I look at Ivor's early childhood life similar to Carl Jung's early childhood life. Like, Jung had, you know, problems at school. He feigned sickness for a period of time, for a year off school, and that when he had this whole inner life started out. Same happened for Ivor when he first contracted, you know, TB, or he had been sick. He was at home for 6 months, you know, got into his music. But again, the similarity between Jung's life and Ivor's life are very, very observable. This whole sense of being a wounded healer. And as you know yourself, when you go down into the psyche and you go through this process of dismemberment and you encounter that, you have that alchemical encounter with the wound that rips you open, tears you apart, and then you come back from that place having healed something within yourself, then it's not just about you anymore. It's not just about, you know, your career or your status or whatever. You know, you have something to do here. You know, you can help others because you've done the work yourself, and that takes over your life. You know that, Rob. I know that. And you know, Ivor was very much a pioneer in that regard, as Groff was in a similar way. But I would equate Ivor more to kind of Jung's experience of the dismemberment process and the dark night of the soul, the Nikia. You know, when he came out of that place, he wrote the Red Book. Ivor was very similar. Ivor had the same kind of life, same kind of experience. It's almost that plutonic dismemberment right down to the core of our being, that when with that alchemical ripping apart and putting back together, you never compromise yourself after that. You never say, I put myself before the other, because you understand suffering. You know that suffering is the growing pains of the soul. And having gone through it yourself, you want to be there for others who are going through it too.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. That's why we do the work we do. I suppose it's no longer a choice, really.
Exactly.
I would like to talk a little bit about now about the work or the friendship between Stan Groff and Ivor Browne, because Stan Groff, for those I'm sure most people here know, but he was probably the greatest pioneer of psychedelic therapy in the world and non-ordinary states of consciousness. But Stan was heavily influenced by Ivor Browne, and they were friends. And he came to Dublin on several occasions, and also published some of Ivor's work. So when did you first meet Stan, and can you talk a little bit about that, their friendship?
Yeah. Stan came to Ireland first in 1980, and then came a couple of years later, where he did some workshops in, in County Louth, and then in St. Brendan's. And I'd heard about that, and I was kicking myself that I hadn't been on the scene at that time. I'd first discovered Stan's work when literally his book, The Realms of the Human Unconscious, dropped off the shelf in the library in the place where I was training as a counselor. And then I wrote to Stan Groff because I was so impressed by, and again, another psychiatrist writing about this crazy kind of stuff that I was into. And I got a letter back from Stan, handwritten letter. I mean, incredible. It blew my mind at the time that, he took the time out to write a handwritten letter. And in that letter, there were 2 brochures for the holotropic breathwork training that he'd only started really in a few years earlier, the actual training program. But he was doing them in the Findhorn Institute in Scotland. And so nothing to do with me. Nothing was going to stop me. So I enrolled in the training, and I think it was 87, 88. I did my first module in Findhorn, and then I did more modules later on there, and then was in Prague and in California and San Francisco, and I completed the full holotropic breathwork training I was completed by 91, 92. So having met Stan and coming from Ireland and knowing Ivor, I got to talk with Stan about the work that was going on. And Stan was very impressed with Ivor's work. I mean, at one point later on, Stan was heard to say that the best holotropic breathwork in the world was happening in Ireland, because there were workshops. The transpersonal psychotherapy group was running. That was myself and some colleagues had set up this organization after Ivor had retired and the church project wasn't available anymore. But before that, we had been working with Ivor in a place called Dowdstown House, which is in County Meath here, running workshops for therapists and trainees. And he came down regularly to run workshops for us. And then, the rest of history. I opened Dundee Park here and started running the holotropic breath work here. So it was through Ivor that I discovered Stan's work, and the feedback from Stan to Ivor was with a huge respect. As I said, he hadn't come across anybody in the world at that time doing the work in the way Ivor was doing it within the institutional settings. That was.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah, I want to speak a bit more about that in a minute. So just a short clip here for this film on that work with Ivor was doing.
Yeah, we mentioned R.D. Lang there, but you also, I think, brought Stan Groff over to speak at one stage, did you?
There was a little Protestant church down in the corner of the grounds of St. Brendan's, and I had set that up as a sort of special unit. And I remember with Paddy Brennan, a big dub, we put quadraphonic sound into it, and also altered the decor, and so that was something of a haven. And I did a lot of psychotherapy beauty work and group therapy down there, patients lying on couches.
And explain what that is, that sort of group therapy. Explain how it worked.
So we had this sound that we could turn on and put on all kinds of jungle sounds or whatever you wanted, to stimulate emotions. And
then what would you have used?
And then there'd be 12 or up to 14 patients, both men and women, lying on couches in that little church. So that was our main therapeutic center.
And were you doing regression with them, or what were you
Yeah.
doing?
So it was very different from the rest of the hospital.
Yeah.
And that was where I mainly worked.
And did you use hallucinogenics or anything?
Yes, I had LSD. I didn't have ayahuasca at that time. That came later. But I had LSD, and also I used this treatment that Stan Groff had developed of some body work and hyperventilation, and you could bring people into an altered state with that. And I'd only use the LSD if they couldn't get into an altered state of consciousness with the breathing and some body manipulation.
And was there not resistance from the more conservative elements to what you were doing in the church?
Well, an interesting thing is that there were a number of psychiatrists working in St. Brendan. None of them ever went down to visit that little therapeutic centre I had. So the hospital tended to remain in its antediluvian state.
He had a wicked sense of humor too, right? Antediluvian state. You know, he was a funny man, wasn't he? And he was always smiling. That's what I remember of him. But I'd love to speak now, but probably about some of the most profound and important work that Ivor Browne did, and that was around, like you mentioned before, the frozen present or unexperienced experience. And I think this is where Ivor Browne was really a great man, because you know, somatic trauma therapy has become something of a buzzword in therapy now, with, you know, Dr. Gabor Mate, the incredible work he's doing, Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, you know, seminal book on trauma therapy, and Dr. Peter Levine, who's now considered, you know, the world leading expert on trauma. But of course, Ivor Browne was saying this 40 years ago. And the story is that in 1985, he wrote a paper called The Unexperienced Experience, and he published it in the Journal of Irish Psychiatry. And the story goes that it received 0 citations at the time. In other words, nobody anywhere listened to what he had to say. But then Stan Groff actually republished this paper in 1990 in Revision magazine, because he felt it was really important. And this concept that Browne, you know, Browne was heavily influenced by the early work of Freud in this regard. So pre-1897 Freud, in the early years, Freud was very influenced by Charcot and Breuer, who believed that trauma was held in the body as a result of real sexual abuse or traumatic experiences. And that was Freud's original theory till 1897. And Ivor Browne was really interested in why Freud changed his mind. So after 1897, when Freud was pretty much ostracized by the community in Vienna, because if his theories were correct, it meant there was an epidemic of sexual abuse and things in the high society of Paris and Vienna. So he changed to a more symbolic version of trauma as a, you know, a fantasy from childhood, Oedipus complex, so on. So yeah, I'd like to just speak into this, that you know, this idea of the frozen present.
Yeah.
Come in there.
And again, yeah, again, it shows Ivor's courage in this regard. You know, as you rightly say, that Freud had discovered that you know, the frozen present or coax system was at play back in his work, and changed the whole thing around, because he put the psychoanalytic movement before the truth of what was really going on. And because of social pressure, and he was isolated in society back then, and particularly in the psychoanalytic movement, he changed. And that was a huge mistake. And it created huge problems in the whole area of psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy ever since. That has caused all sorts of schisms and splits. And you know, it's a huge disappointment, you know, in what I see as it was a missed opportunity. And it was his renegades then, Otto Rank, Wilhelm Reich, Carl Jung, and Adler, and others, who separated out from Freud and went their own way. But particularly say the likes of Otto Rank and the birth trauma theory, which he came up with, that to say Freud went into, you know, a huge depression after this, because he felt threatened by the fact that this was going to usurp his authority as the originator of psychoanalysis. But it was the renegades, as I say. And so in that sense, Ivor was a renegade, in the sense that even though he got huge opposition to his ideas and his philosophies, and as you say, his published material, which was seminal at the time, got 0 citations, and only for Stan Groff intervened and got it published, and published it in his own books, in fact. So in that sense, you can see Ivor here again. The easy road for him would have been to roll over. He had his professorship. He could have been an academic. He well respected in academic circles if he played ball. But there was something in him that couldn't do that, because he was only interested in academia if it meant that he could find solutions for the problems of the people that he was working with. And so therefore, and as you say, that work, you put that work beside Stan Groff's work, and that they're both, again, running parallel. Stan Groff called it the COEX system. Ivor had the frozen present and the unequivocally experience. Peter Levine actually wrote to Ivor way back in the day when he came across his work first, to congratulate him on his discoveries, and saying that he was working very much along the same lines. And this was way back before Levine became well known. So absolutely, again, you see the different components of Ivor here. Not only was he a brilliant intellectual, and genius in his own right, but he married that very well, and unusual in a psychiatrist, that he had the heart and the compassion and the care, as well as the intelligence and the innovative, creative mind to come up with new ideas.
Yeah, thank you. We'd love to speak into the heart part in a little while, but for now, just a short clip in his own words on the frozen present and the concept of the unexperienced experience.
Yeah, we mentioned R.D. Laing there, but you also, I think, brought Stan Groff over to speak at one stage, did you?
There was a little Protestant church down in the corner of the grounds of St. Brendan's.
I think that's the wrong clip there, but the basic idea is, like you say, that he would use catharsis to in a safe way to go help people re-experience this trauma, and in doing so process it in real time, so it no longer is locked in the body, and that people can integrate this part over time, so they no longer, the traumatic experience no longer has the emotional charge that and this is how we work with Inward Bound, and how it's been taken almost for granted now that this is a very powerful method of therapy. However, at that time, it wasn't, right. This was pretty new, at least in a group setting. So there's some quotes here. It's people can have a deeper look if they wish. But it's all about safety, creating that container, and allowing, and getting into those non-ordinary states of consciousness to help people catharsize and process these experiences. This is the clip I wanted to show, I think.
And what did you hope to achieve with that therapy in the church?
Bringing people, that became my main work then over the years, of people who'd been traumatized in various ways, and bringing them through regression back to the traumatic experience, and helping them to go into the experience which they had. I coined the term the frozen present. They had farmed it out into a frozen state, but not dealt with or integrated. So it was a case of opening that up and getting them to go through the integration of the experience, which involved what's sometimes loosely called the limbic brain, or the center part of the brain, where the hippocampus is, and where memory is dealt with and formed. So that was the key area for working with people and getting them to go through regression and bringing these traumatic experiences through that part of the brain, which is a small part down in the base of the brain, and didn't involve the cerebrum and the frontal lobes to any great extent. It was much more, it was the part of the brain linked to the body through the vagus nerve. So it was vegetative work.
And Ivor, I know those sessions in the church in Brendan's were very intense, very extreme. Did you ever worry that people would kind of lose themselves even more in that experience?
No, I generally didn't. I felt that if you could bring people into experience and help them to work through it, then they came out the other side. It's only if they funked that and wouldn't do the work and then it became frozen. And then a lot of the work, as I say, was opening up those, what I call the frozen present. I called it that because when you help people to release that, it didn't come as a memory, it came as them going into the experience as if it was happening now. And that's why I called the term the frozen present. And that helped them then, if they could integrate that, then of course they were able to be free and develop much more.
So they could integrate their trauma into their life.
Instead of having shelved it and frozen it.
What I love about this, he's talking about polyvagal theory there, but he's also talking about personal responsibility in healing, which is important, I think. Just going to skip a few slides here. This idea of personal responsibility, and that he was very humanistic in that way, and that we can't heal anyone else. It's up to the individual, which isn't always a very popular opinion, but he seemed to believe that.
Absolutely, because mainstream psychiatry is about fixing people. It's about applying a method or a pharmaceutical intervention or ECT or something to fix the symptoms. And Stan Groff gave a good analogy on that. He said, you're driving along in your car and the red light comes on the dash, and you go down to your mechanic and you show it to the mechanic and he just yanks out the wire and the red light goes off, and you drive on down the road and your car blows up. He says you're not going to be very happy about that. So that's the sense with what mainstream psychiatry is. It's just pulling the plug on the light. The underlying problem's still there. When you marry Ivors' idea about the frozen present with Stan Groff's coax system, and also other things I spoke to Ivor about with regards, karma and synchronicities or whatever, I came up with this idea, talking it through with him. This idea that the coax system of the frozen past is like a constellation of energy that is frozen within the unconscious. And it leaks up into everyday awareness as the symptoms of anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, psychosis. But not only that, it creates a resonant frequency vibration that emanates as an energy field around the person that draws into their life experience, people, situations, and experiences that directly resonate with what was within themselves. It's like what Jung said when he said, the psychological rule is we meet in life as fate that which we hold within ourselves. When you look at Ivors' work and marry it in with Jung and Groff, you see that not only is the frozen present affecting them in their everyday life in terms of creating psychiatric and mental health problems for them, but it is also determining their destiny, their soul's destiny in life, because it is creating the circumstances and drawing the people, situations, and experiences into them that is causing them further issues, because they're triggering the event in terms of the universal resonance reverting back to them, which is also coming from within themselves. Now, as you know, through psilocybin therapy and holotropic breathwork and other work, once you open that frozen present, that part that is locked within the psyche, several things happen. First of all, the energy begins to dissipate and release, and it comes up as anxiety, fear, stress, emotional discharge, catharsis. When that happens and you work with it long enough, those symptoms in the middle world begin to alleviate and dissipate. So the anxiety is less, depression lifts, psychosis begins to settle. Then, most interestingly, what I found is not only is there an alleviation of the symptoms, but that person's life then changes in the sense that their reality shifts. There's a timeline shift in their reality because they're no longer resonating at that frequency, which therefore is not drawing life experiences to them from other people's situations. So not only do they change from the inside out, the external universe responds back to them in a different way because their frequency resonance vibration has shifted. So therefore, the universe responds to them in terms, and this is what Ivor talked about, the brain being an antenna. I see it as like a radio, like that it transmits and receives consciousness. Consciousness is not generated within the brain. The brain is a mediator of consciousness in the sense that we live in a field of consciousness, what they call the collective unconscious. So the brain mediates that. So if we are traumatized, and like the radio set analysis, again, one of the crystals in the radio set is damaged, then the perception of reality is going to be damaged as well. With trauma release therapy, you're actually not only releasing it on an emotional psychological basis, but you're also rewiring the brain. You know, there's new dendritic neuroplasticity begins to emerge, and we see more and more of that happening in the studies in neurofeedback and neurophysiology, that not only do we change on an emotional, but the brain also responds to the treatment as well.
Absolutely, and you know, and at heart, it requires a courage or a movement on the part of the individual to either they need to go there themselves or be willing to face those fears or the pain on some level. And no therapy, including psilocybin or any psychedelic therapy, will automatically somehow fix these things, or any therapist. It requires a willingness of the individual to walk that path and a courage, I suppose. So just like to talk a little bit about the, you know, he wasn't completely against biomedical psychiatry or medication, but he did believe, I think, that they were greatly overprescribed, and he was a pioneer of social psychiatry. So I've heard him, he loved this quote, I think, around Jiddu Krishnamurti: "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And, you know, Ireland was a sick society, maybe it still is. So he did set up 2 community mental health organizations in Dublin and Derry, or, you know, Derry at the time, of course, was a war zone, more or less. And he played an important role in the closure of Leros Asylum in Greece, which at the time I think was one of the really the most brutal psychiatric institutions in Europe. So he, yeah. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, you look at, again, this was Ivor in action. You know, he went to Derry, you know, worked with Paddy Doherty there, down the bog side. It was full-on war at the time. I remember at the time I lived in Dundalk, the refugees coming across the border, being burned out of their homes and houses in Belfast, and being housed around Dundalk. And also, as some of them were housed in St Brendan's in where Ivor was. And he got involved in Derry. Like, I mean, he was on the front line there. I mean, you know, he was in houses when the British Army were raiding people and carrying them off with Paddy Doherty, you know, seeing what was going on firsthand and the injustices that were happening. And he worked with the, you know, the foundation to develop the inner city, the Bogside. They rebuilt the Bogside. They created these centers, and then they had therapeutic intervention for a lot of the young traumatized people at the time, and did amazing work with bringing healing to deep trauma that was going. I worked in Northern Ireland in different instances, and you know, you see the deep trauma that's generational amongst the people there. Ivor was up there doing that work when nobody else was. Nobody else wanted to touch it, of course. And then when you say when he went to Leros and the tremendous, horrendous kind of situation that was there, he got involved, and he was asked to get involved from the EU because of his reputation. I think they knew he'd do a good job there. And then, of course, Ballyfermot took himself out into the community, working with people. That was horrendous. You know, it was the social problems at the time. You know, creating alcoholisms, you know, child sexual abuse, you know, people living on the edge of poverty. People tend to forget how bad things were in this country at the time. But Ivor wasn't just sitting behind his desk. In fact, he got out from behind the desk in all his encounters with his patients. He went out there, rolled up his sleeves, and if that meant, you know, getting somebody food for the table, or help financially, or something else, he'd go out and get involved at that level. It wasn't just, oh, I'm the professor of psychiatry, I'm going to sit behind my desk and, you know, come from that particular position. So that was the nature of the man, you know, that very unusual. I've never come across anybody who in his position, did what he did in terms of his compassion for other people, and that he was prepared to put himself on the line to help others.
Thank you. Yeah. So he was a critic of the biomedical, reductionist view of psychiatry, which is getting a lot of flack right now. So yeah, he just a few obituaries that he came in when 1960, that Ireland apparently at that time had more people incarcerated in mental hospitals than the Soviet Union. Ireland in the 1950s and 60s was a pretty brutal place. If people may not know how powerful the Catholic Church was, and indeed he fell foul of the Catholic Church on one or two occasions. But I would like to really speak about it now, because I think it's really important, his relationship with the heart. And this is again why I think he's such a good man, because he was an intellectual, he's a brilliant man, but he really put the heart at the center of mental health. And we just don't hear that as a conversation, that actually the key to a lot of healing is through the heart, not the mind. And that is actually one of the great problems with mental health, is that we're completely bypassing the body and the heart. So just a couple of quotes around that. This is from one of his later papers, I think, or writings. The truth of all of this is that the heart is at the center. And if our heart is closed, we cannot experience love. I mean, such profound, simple truths. But yet you don't hear these conversations in mainstream, usually anyway, in mainstream medical work. And this as well, key to processing trauma is cultivating a relationship that allows it to be processed, and that ultimately involves love. And the deepest traumas we can experience involve a separation from love. So he did have that. Like, I met him through the meditations he would do in the Lantern Center every Tuesday. This was probably a decade ago. He was already an old man. He was mid-80s. And he would come and he would sit every week. We would sit in meditation with him. And he did have this aura. He was a great man. And I don't know if I've met many great men in my life, but when you met Ivor, there was a sense of his greatness. And there was such compassion and wisdom that would radiate from him. So he kind of embodied this heartfulness aspect, at least when I met him later in life. And he was a deeply spiritual man. In 1978, he went to India, and he met this guru, and he followed this path called Sahaj Marg, and it's basically a heartfulness meditation. So he saw, I think the spiritual heart part was huge for him, right?
Yeah, very much so. Like, way ahead of his time again. We see now that the Heart Math Institute in the United States, I'm doing a lot of interesting research and development on the heart as the emperor organ, as they call it, and how it has an intelligence and a brain of its own, and that in fact that is our essential center. And Ivor was aware of the fact that we weren't just talking about the physical heart here, but we were talking about the heart on an etheric, energetic, astral level as well, that it was a portal for the love and compassion of the creator, the God energy, to manifest and come through us. And Ivor was absolutely right about that, and you and I would agree with that, that if there's no heart in the matter, then no healing really can take place at that point of view. And like Ivor, as you say, wasn't totally against medication, and neither would I be. I see the use for medication for taking people down off a clearly psychotic state, or a manic episode in bipolar, or a lifting in depression. But what Ivor would do is he would give small amounts of medication and then wean people off, and then introduce them into that heartfelt place of compassion and kindness using psychotherapy. But you're right, when you sat with Ivor or you met him, as you said earlier, he was always smiling and laughing. He was always making jokes about himself as well. He said to me one time, a joke, he said, I'm that old, he says, when I fart dust, And that was a typical kind of joke that Ivor would have about himself. Always putting himself down in some way, but the people flocked around him. We would have him here for the Spirit Folk Festival, and I had him at the Soul Seminars when we used to run it in the Lantern Centre in Dublin. And we would have to get a bigger room. I mean, we'd normally have about maybe 70 people there. the first night he came, there was nearly 200 people turned up. We had to move out of the room. People just flocked to see Ivor. People who'd never met him before, people who didn't know him, but they just heard about him, and they were drawn to him. And then he could just sit down in the chair on the stage, as he did here, and just say, he'd just pull out his tin whistle, start playing a tune, or he would just close his eyes and do a meditation, or just speak about something. It didn't matter. You know what? It didn't really matter what he did. It was just the fact that he was there. That's what people just wanted to be in his company. He'd remind me of what he spoke about himself, about his guru, Babaji. That when you be in his company, when he first met him, when he went to India, how he felt and how it, I've had the same kind of energy that when you're in his presence, you felt that. And like, he was no saint in his own view. He was the first that would put his hand up and say, you know, I've done this, I've done that, made mistakes or whatever. He would own that. But at the same time, there was something in him that just was beyond him from a transpersonal point of view. It was like spirit was using him as an anchor to be a conduit for a compassionate healing energy from the heart to dissipate itself into the world here. I think Ivor was like a channel for that loving energy from the heart, really.
Yeah, and that's what I really felt in those precious times, those meditations I had with him over the years. And of course, his hearing was going at that stage, and he was still seeing psychotherapy clients. So there's some amusing stories of people going seeing him, and he not being sure what he was actually, you know, he'd interpret something, maybe not what was actually what they said. So it became, he's a very humorous individual. Yeah, I love this quote from him as well. These are the kind of things that we can talk about through poetry or through the therapeutic model, but we can't deal with these concepts through the psychiatric model at the deepest level. Or at the deepest level, a lot of our problems are spiritual. And I think that's so important these days to bring in the spiritual aspect of the psyche. Otherwise, it's, you know, we're missing the elephant in the room, right? Yeah, you wanted to mention a little bit about his view on shamanism. Shamanism, we can define, I suppose, as using altered states of consciousness for healing, which is what we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. But you're right in what Ivor said about the spiritual. His sense was that psychotherapy was to clear the dross away from the unconscious so that we could become clear channels in order to access the transpersonal realms. When I first met Ivor, I was beginning to get into the shamanism, because what I like about this method is the path of direct revelation, you know, spiritual democracy. And he was very open to that idea, but he didn't know much about shamanism in the true sense of the word. I introduced him to what I was using to him. I call it techno shamanism, just to get him used to the idea of journeying. It was a light and sound machine where you wear goggles in your eyes, flashing light, and sound binaural beats. I remember that was in 1989. I had the first machine. We were at a holotropic breathwork session in Dowdstown House, and he was very taken with this because it induced a deep meditative state, you know, by driving the brain waves from beta down into alpha, into theta, down into delta. And it was through that we got into conversation, and then I used a drum in that session to do a journey. And I was a participant on the workshop he was running. And a very interesting happened. It was a lovely story. It was a summer's evening, the window was opening, and I was relating a shamanic experience I had in the breathwork, where I was this idea of a butterfly and chrysalis and transformation and transpersonal, kind of quite powerful spiritual experiences. Now, back in those days, you didn't, even in a group like that, you were seen as a little bit weird if you talked about that kind of stuff, spirit entities and, you know, the upper world and the light beings and transformation. But Ivor was sitting there listening to this, and the group was a bit kind of, you know, skeptical about what I was trying to talk about in regards to this. Summer's evening, a red admiral butterfly flew into the room, circled the whole room, and landed just here on my forehead. And Ivor was sitting there, and he shouts across the room at Jim O'Donnell. He says, Jim, come here, look at the shaman, look at the shaman, look at the shaman. This idea that, you know, this story that I'd been telling, and the butterfly had come in and synchronistically landed on my third eye, and my fourth, wasn't lost on Ivor. And he talked to the group then about how that reminded him of the experience that Jung had with the scarab beetle with his patient who was relating a story. But it was a pure, beautiful synchronicity. And that was typical of the kind of energy that you would encounter in those groups with Ivor at times.
Beautiful story. Thank you. Yeah, there's a few other little things I'd like to address before we maybe have a few questions. But one is around this beautiful story. I think it was in the Irish Times, a letter. So the story I want to end on was told by an ex-psychiatric nurse. She described an incident that happened while she worked in the Dublin Psychiatric Hospital, Grangegorman, where Ivor also worked. A female patient was undergoing a particular severe psychotic episode. The nurses were quite distressed and immediately called for medical assistance. Presently, they saw a white coat approaching. The doctor considered the situation calmly, and reaching into his coat, he drew out not a syringe, but a tin whistle. He stood there and proceeded to play a few lively jigs and reels, tapping his foot. Before long, the patient ceased her rant and lined up with the nurses to examine this strange specimen of a doctor. She looked at the others, and before going calmly on her way, said, "I think that fellow's a bit mad." It was, of course, none other than the bold Ivor Browne. So the music was a huge part, the traditional Irish, the jigs and the reels, you know, and there was a wildness and a craziness to that music, which, yeah, you know, the power of music to heal people is in hospital settings. I love that concept that he did this, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know now from, you know, using music in psychedelic sessions and in holotropic breathwork that it's a hugely important part and component of the work we do. But Ivor, yeah, that was where his heart and soul was in music. And I love the stories he told way back when he was 17, and a group of friends and himself hired a horse and cart and toured all around Ireland, playing music at the puck fairs and at the flat kills. And like, I mean, this was pre-hippie days. It was like kind of the beatnik generation, like the whole thing going on in America. But Ivor was having his own flower power kind of music encounter here in Ireland. But you can see, and it's again synchronicity, how fate intervenes. If he hadn't had TB at the time when he got it, he would have gone on to be a professional jazz musician. He was that good. And he said himself that, you know, fortunately, fate did intervene, and he was taken on the road he was, and we all benefited from that. But he never lost that love of music. And what I love about his old stories, like he was playing with the greats back in the day, in Christy Moore and all the well-known, you know, folk and traditional musicians that were playing in Ireland at the time. And, you know, I remember around in Dundalk at times, a place called Mark's Bar. It was a bar where all this traditional music was, the next sticky pub, official IRA, but you had to knock on the window to get in. And I remember people coming from all over the country playing traditional music there. And again, Ivor was doing the same kind of thing in Dublin. So there was a real, see, traditional Irish music at that time, people may not realize, it was a lot of young people, our generation at that time, being reintroduced to our culture again, to our heritage. And I have to say, people like Planksty and Horstips I was mad into at the time, you know, they brought this electronic music, Irish music, into the electronic kind of genre. And a lot of us then cottoned on to, well, there's more to this, and we got into the traditional music. So what Ivor was very much involved with there was regenerating a dying cultural phenomenon, because the people at the time of my generation and before, like, you looked at Irish traditional music as something, you know, ancient and archaic. It was like something that you didn't want to have anything to do with. But Ivor was very much ahead of his time in that regard too, in not only playing Irish music, but he was involved in the preservation of the tradition as well.
And yeah, he gave an interesting podcast just a few years before he died around the ancestral use of psilocybin, and he compared it to the ayahuasca traditions in Peru. That we would have had that, which is I think Rory Kiernan's podcast is very worth a listen.
Yeah.
So we recognize this deep ancestral connection we have to the land, to the medicine of the land, and to our own ancestral traditions here in Ireland. And I see him very much in that view, in that lineage almost.
Yeah.
This is a photo of you and Ivor. I think I took this in 2017 at Dundee Park. It's a beautiful photo.
I wonder where that came from. Yeah. That was Ivor. Yeah, I mean, he was great. Like, he always supported me in the work that I was doing here at Dundee Park at the Oak Tree Charitable Trust, because all I'd have to do is give Ivor the wind of the word. I'd say, Ivor, I'm running a Spirit of Folk festival, or a seminar, would you come down and give a talk at it? Because I knew very well he was going to be a big draw, and I'd get people in through the gates if Ivor was going to be there. But he never said no. He was always saying, no problem, I'll be there. And he'd arrive down, and we'd have the crack. And himself and the nephew used to get on famously as well. They had great rapport between each other. And you know, sure, if Ivor was going to be at an event, you'd have lots of people at it. So that was some of the happiest moments like we had when that's in the tent here at Dunderry Park. And again, I remember that well, just the sense of his energy, the experience of the atmosphere, that people still talk about it. They remember Ivor, they remember him here, they remember him giving that talk and doing that meditation. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a privilege to be there that day. Yeah, just a few words about his legacy, maybe, before we open up to questions. I mean, from my perspective, as someone who's working in this field now of psychedelic-assisted therapy, Ivor was so far ahead of his time. I mean, he was using group therapy. He was talking about the importance of the therapeutic relationship. He was doing this 65, 70 years ago. And, you know, we're only catching up now to really what the work that he was doing, and the potential of this work. It still hasn't been fully utilized. It still hopefully will grow, I would hope, and help a lot of people from that place of heart, because I don't think, and from that place of personal responsibility, I don't think there's any other way around that, you know.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you, Rob. Yeah. We stand on the shoulders of the greats, and in my view, the greats are Stan Groff, Carl Gustav Jung, and Ivor Browne. And I put those three together in equal measure in regards to the influence that they've had on me personally, and the ground foundations of the work I still do would be very much taken from Ivor's work as well as Groff and Jung's work. And I see him as important as that, because, and what's even more special is that he's Irish. He developed his work out of the context of this country, out of this culture, out of this heritage and ancestry. And I see him like an old druid, an old bard going around with his fiddle or his music or his pipes or his tin whistle. And he was a great storyteller too. And so he was the bard, he was the ovate in terms of being the healer, but he also was the druid in the sense that he was the philosopher. He was the spiritual master. He was the connection to the God spark. He was, you know, the epitome of kindness and loving and grace. So that's how, when I think of Ivor, I see him as an old druid that incarnated back in here this time to keep alive the traditions of our past. And so it's up to you and me and the likes of us now, Rob, to, and I love doing this today, honoring his work, but carrying it forward in the way that he created, with kindness, compassion, integrity, and in a way that is putting the other person first. Because unfortunately today in our world, we see a lot of shamanism, we see a lot of narcissistic spirituality, we see a lot of people out there Instagramming themselves here, there, and everywhere, and they put up this front of this persona of being the spiritual master, the spiritual guru or shaman or teacher. There was none of that with Ivor. You knew what you got when you met him. You knew he was coming from a good place. And that is what I model myself on. I know that's what you model yourself on. That sense of integrity, that sense of doing the work as a wounded healer because you've been in that place yourself. And the world needs it now more than ever. And so it's up to us to carry on the work as the pioneers that went before us meant it to be done.
Yeah, thank you. What a beautiful, beautiful way to close, and honoring this great man. And he really was a great man. To all those who knew him, to his family, we honor the greatness of the great Ivor Browne. So thank you for joining me today, Martin. We may have time for some questions, I think. Let me see if I can manage to open up to questions. So there's one hand raised about how to ask questions. Just give me 1 second. Yeah. So is there any questions? Maybe you could put them in the in the chat for now, because I've seemed to have problems turning on the sound for other people. If anyone wants to type a question, open queue. Oh, here we go. LJ Jan, I think you can ask a question now if you want to. Ask.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, wonderful. Sorry, I'm not used to this platform. The question will be very straightforward and simple, but before I ask it, I just wanted to thank, because this really I've never heard of Ivor, and I'm quite angry about it, because I am currently doing a course at University of Exeter, which I think is the first academic course, and it's brilliant. But now that I know about Ivor, I'm really gutted that he's not in the materials. I haven't learned about him up until today. So I really want to thank, because the legacy sounds, it really made me emotional listening to both of you and his legacy, and I really would like to learn more about him. So really the question from that is, where could I learn more about him other than Wikipedia, as well as will this video be shared, this recording?
Yes, thank you for that question. And one of my main intentions of doing this was to raise awareness of his work, because you're right, he's more or less been written out of the history of, psychedelic assisted therapy. And I would like to address that by sharing this video on YouTube. As for his work, he wasn't a very prolific writer, but I recommend you look at the films, read his books, Music and Madness, and the collected works, I think, or collected writings, Ivor Browne. And then he's got some great videos and podcasts that were done in the past number of years, especially the Meetings with Ivor film. You get a real sense of the man through that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If anyone else would like to ask a question, if you can raise your hand, or you see the little icon at the bottom, and we can, there's a little palm at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, you can ask a question if anyone wants to. We got Mairead Collins. Let me just go ahead there, Mairead. Can't quite hear you. Let me see. Can we unmute? Can't hear you there, Mairead. You might have to unmute yourself.
Hiya, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thanks very much for today. It's great just hearing all about Ivor and honouring him and the way you are doing. I'm just like to ask, going forward, what do you see, like the changes, or that what you were talking about today and Ivor's legacy going forward, what we can do, or what you'd like to see happen, or what can happen, or what is happening to make it progressive and bring this, the changes that are necessary in?
Well, for me, I mean, it's a big question, but for me, what jumps out is straight away is the bringing the heart and the sense of soul back into healing, into mental health. I feel there's a disconnect there that needs to be addressed. That would be the first thing that comes to me. I don't know what.
Okay. Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah, for me, I think it's continuing doing the work you're doing, Rob, and the work I'm doing here at Dundee Park, which is working with non-ordinary states of consciousness, and the shamanic. For me, it's a shamanic perspective, because shamanism is about connecting to nature. It's about connecting to spirits. It's the realization that we're not alone in our own skin-encapsulated ego, as Alan Watts would have said, but we have help from beyond ourselves. Now, mainstream psychiatry and psychology and even psychotherapy doesn't address the fact that, we're not alone, that when we reach out and we have spirit helpers or guides, that we can access directly through journeying or meditation, whatever, as Ivor did, that's a part of our healing. And, for me anyway, that's what I promote. That's what I say to folk, and that's what I teach. It's not something you'll hear within the medical institutions. Spirituality is more or less sidelined or not even spoke about. And Carl Jung even taught that the training colleges in most medical establishments. So it's for me, as I would agree with Rob, bring the heart in, bring spirituality back in, bring the sense of listening to people for what really is going on for them. When somebody comes to me and they say, I hear voices, I say, tell me about the voices. I don't say, oh, you're imagining you're hearing voices. I say, I want to know what those voices are saying to you. Because for me, it may be that you are hearing voices, that you really are hearing voices, that you're hearing voices from somewhere else. And I don't dismiss you as some psychotic schizophrenic that is having delusions, because I've heard voices. When I journey, I see things. So in terms of the change you're talking about, I think, I'd like to see more of the shamanic sensibility or transpersonal theory taught more in the medical situation, certainly, but particularly in the psychotherapeutic training that's going on as well, because it's not often present. I have students who come to me from training institutions in counseling and psychotherapy that tell me they can't talk about the stuff that they come to talk to me about because they think, or they know that it wouldn't be understood or respected within the institution they're training in. And that's kind of spiritual stuff. So that's what I'd like to see change, more of that brought into curriculums.
Thanks very much. And yeah, that it could be more recognized and seen as a genuine practice for healing and health. And I think in general as well, like with the heart, like just in communities, in friendships, that we become more aware of how powerful the heart is. And our focus has been on the mind, which has its part, but the heart and the problems, I think, all over our community and the world, for heart intelligence and emotional intelligence, and to make decisions coming from that place, that if it's going to hurt or harm anyone, well, then we don't do it, regardless of the profit or the benefit. So thanks very much to the both of you for today.
Thank you, Mairead.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We have Katrina Campbell. We'll take a couple more questions. I'm just going to unmute yourself there, Katrina, and Iwona, you're next after that. Just make sure you unmute yourself, Katrina. Just click the unmute button, Katrina, if you can, on the bottom left. Might come back to Katrina. Maybe Iwona, if you can figure out how to unmute yourself, Katrina, we'll come back to you. Iwona. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Good
Hello.
to see you.
How is Katrina there? Hello.
No, continue. Please continue.
Okay. Thank you. What a wonderful way to honor this beautiful soul, Ivor. It's the first time I've heard about him, and all that was shared. It's just it's like a perfect timing, I believe, for everyone that just gathered here. And to myself, all that was said, I made plenty of notes, but to know that beautiful being from your stories, it to myself, it gives me courage to where I stand myself right now. I'm in Poland. I used to live in Ireland almost 10 years, and I came back here 2.5 years ago to my hometown, tiny hometown, where the word shamanism or spiritual work is not so known. And only last week, the big doors open up for my work to step into a new role, new path, to work with people and to work with employees in institutions. It's a kind of tiny project we're doing here. It's something completely new for me. And it feels like I have no idea what I'm doing, yet it's the heart is guiding so strongly that you just drop the mind and you follow the whatever you feel. And hearing the Ivor story, it really gives that courage to move forward. For this work, I have 3 groups where I'm sharing meditations, like relaxations, and what I called imagination work, because in here where I am, you wouldn't really say shamanism yet. There's communities that you have to be just more aware of how you share stuff before people are ready to hear that. So stepping into that, to bring that love, to bring that open heart and share that, and finding the language to do it from this beautiful, colorful Ireland that I was living, which was so open to all of that. And I'm so grateful for that and all the work that I've done in Dunderry. So really bringing this here, it seems like, you have no idea what you're doing, yet it's like you jump off the cliff and you're just in it. So it's only started last week for me, and every day I think, God, I don't know what to do, but just help me to figure it out this, tomorrow and the next day, and the help is coming. So hearing that story and all, like Martin said about Ivor a few times, that compassion that he had, this is something that I want to remind myself of when I'll go and share whatever is there to be shared with others, to have that compassion for people, to have that open heart, and to have courage to just to move forward. So that's what I wanted just to say, and thank you so much, and thank you, and blessed be the soul of Ivor, so he can assist all of us in this beautiful journey. And thank you, Martin, and thank you, Rob, and everyone that's gathered here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivona, and good luck with it. Good to see you, and good luck on it. Sometimes you just got to start, right?
Yeah, and I would like to say to encourage you to keep going, and to all of you out there. You see, the way I see it is this: Ivor was a soul that incarnated here in the late 1920s. He was a pioneer. He was a predecessor. He was somebody that came in first. Then my generation came along in the mid-1950s when I was born. That was the second wave that came in, of what I call helper souls. We incarnate in here with a purpose. We have a mission, and it is a mission. We're here to anchor and act as a conduit for light, from spirit, for love, for compassion, to come into this world, this third density at this time of darkness and increasing Kali Yuga darkness. Ivor was a pioneer. He passed the mantle on to my generation. And now we're passing that mantle on to Rob's generation and your generation. That's why I'm very happy and glad to be a part of this today, because I see your generation coming up now, and it heartens me to see people like you and Rob and others who have the courage of your convictions to do the work you do. It takes courage. It's the way of the wounded healer. We have to work on our own issues. We have to be dismembered. We have to go through it. There are opposing forces. The Wetiko forces that are playing the world today are opposing the resurgence of new consciousness, new awakening, and new awareness that's coming onto this planet at the moment. The helper souls are sometimes targeted, blocked, and try to be prevented from doing what they are doing. I've had that experience in my life many times when I work within the psychiatric system and outside it. Ivor came across that. You can see it in the whole aspect of his life. And see, that's his legacy for me and for us. The legacy is, no matter what happens, no matter what obstacles you come up against, have the courage to keep going. Because here's the thing, we're not alone. When we reach out to help, to our higher selves, or to our spirit beings, or to whoever you call your angel or whatever, it'll be there. And it's just take the steps, keep going, don't lose heart. because that's what the Wetiko forces in our world want us to do, is to lose heart, become despondent, be depressed and despair, and then we give up, and we give up the power. We have more power than we think or know or allowed to know to make changes in this world. And all we have to do is to be a small little beacon of light in where you are in Poland, where Rob is, where I am, where everybody out there is. Just keep holding the faith, folks. Don't give up. And I love the fact that you're back in Poland doing what you're doing. And I really feel for you there. And you have our support here anytime you need it.
Thank you. What a powerful answer there. So we'll take 3 more questions. So Katrina, Annette, and Declan, and then we'll close. So if we off you go, Katrina.
Hello, how are you? Hi, how are things? So I think I've nearly forgotten what my question was. Hello, Martin. Hi, Rob. So just, I suppose my question is so I'm a teacher from the education sector for young people who are still, say, in secondary school, they're getting ready to go to college and stuff, just based on, I suppose, the community contribution Ivor made to the ordinary Joe Soap throughout Ireland, throughout his whole lifetime. What avenues in the holistic sector would be ideal for someone who's, say, in 5th year leaving cert, doesn't know what they want to do with their lives? What do you think, what advice do you think, if Ivor was sitting on a chair and you'd 5th years and 6th years, they're able to ask them questions about what they should do with their lives, what advice do you think he would give?
It's a very hard question for me to answer. What would you think there, Martin?
I'd say get out of school. Don't buy the bullshit. It's a programming system that your mind is being taken over and programmed by a system that doesn't have your best interest at heart. They want to label you as ADHD, ADD, or some other anomaly or problem or diagnosis that thinks and says that there's something wrong with you. He would say, and I would say certainly, there's nothing wrong with you. You are having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, because our educational system does not embody heart or soul. It does not care about the growth of the young pupil in terms of finding their own individuality and individuating to a higher level, a higher perspective. It has only one agenda, and that agenda is to corral, control, program, and turn us into nice little slaves for the machine, for that matrix machine. Ivor knew about that. Ivor was well aware of that, was what was going on. And if you look at his own educational background, he succeeded in spite of the fact that he was at school and in the educational system. He failed most of his early examinations for medical entrance exams and stuff like that. And yet, there was something in it that he didn't get in the classroom at school. There was inherently an innate within himself. And that was that spark of spirit that they couldn't put out. And I would say to those kids in that classroom, don't let them put the spark of spirit out in you. Be yourself, be who you are. And I see young kids come to me all the time now who are brilliant, genius. They're very highly evolved souls who are struggling against the system. They're system busters. They've come here to make change. And they won't listen to the bullshit that they're being programmed with so much anymore. So I don't know what Ivor would say. I'd say it'd be something along the same lines of what I've just said, but that would be my take on it.
Thank you very much, Martin.
On a practical level, I'd introduce them to the work of, the basic bones of the work of Joseph Campbell on the hero's journey, which is an incredible model for life, and it's used as a model for teens, I know, in many youth organizations, because it helps people understand that life is not linear and has its cyclical ups and downs and challenges. So I wish I had that information when I was, 16, 17.
I got offered a wonderful opportunity. Ivor met Babaji. I'm not sure what year it was, Martin. Was it in the 1970s?
79.
Yeah. And that organization charity is still running globally. It's moved its name from Sahaj Marg to Heartfulness. And they're the biggest meditation center in the world now, and they have 3 schools set up out in southern India. Well, they're central southern India in Hyderabad. They've actually offered 15 Irish students to have an opportunity to go to school there for a week. So it may be something that schools might be interested in for January 2025. If there's any spiritual souls out there looking, it might be an opportunity for them.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you.
So we'll go to Annette. Annette from Dundary Park. Great to see you, Annette. And hope you're well. If you just unmute yourself, Annette, the little button on the microphone button. It's that little button on the bottom left corner. Maybe we'll go to...
Okay.
Oh yeah, there we go. There we go.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well done, the two of you. It's been tremendous to listen. I've heard a lot of it. I mean, I knew Ivor. The man was a walking sense of kindness. There was so much a sense of fun and enjoyment and just joy within him, that wherever he went, he brought that with him. And there was no ego. That was one of the things that was so amazing and wonderful, because he never sat on a pedestal. When he came, either to Dundee or to anywhere else, he was just one of the group. He wanted to listen to everybody and hear them and just enjoy them. And I mean, it's like as Martin said, you know, I've come up against different things and people shouting in my face that, you know, this isn't where I should be going. But, you know, stick with who you are and keep going, which is what I'd say to anybody else, either in school or wherever. Just be who you are. And I think that's one of the things that Ivor did. He was who he was, and that was such a tremendous thing. And he had a huge amount of integrity, which was one of the things that I always remember saying to Martin many years ago, that when I started in Dundee with the shamanic courses, that as long as there was integrity, I was there. If integrity left, I was out the door before it. And Ivor, I mean, I remember here, he was with Darren, the car broke down and they brought him up here to the house. We had to get the car towed and all the rest to get a tractor. Came in, sat down in the kitchen, had a cup of tea and a great laugh. He was just such an enjoyable person to have around, apart from all the teachings. And just being in his presence, as you say, you felt the grace of the man, but he didn't see that. And that was one of the parts of it that I thought was so magical. He never saw. He knew it in his soul how good he was and the work that he was doing, but he never acted as though he saw how good he was. So that's wonderful. As Yvonne here and back to Poland. Thank you both. A great, and sort of looking back and how I think he'd be looking down. Good on you.
Thank you, Annette. You're just breaking up there at the end, but thank you for your beautiful, the core of it was how humble and how egoless he was, you know, and how much fun and all of those things. And thank you, both you and Martin, for all the amazing work you've done at Dundee with integrity over the years. It's really changed many people in Ireland, including myself. So anyone who wants to know more about that, you can look it up at shamanismireland.com. The incredible work that Annette and Martin have done for decades now, following on from Ivor's work. I think we'll close with Declan Hammond. Declan's a pioneer of this work here in Ireland, so great to have you here, Declan.
Guys, thank you so much. I've been just enjoying here, tears in my eyes, bringing back so many memories. I've worked with Michael Curry, who you mentioned there, at the Institute of Psychosocial Medicine in Dunleary. over about a 20-year period. Ivor was working there. And one of the things that I really learned from both of them was how individual health and challenges, mental, spiritual, emotional challenges, and society's challenges, how they were inextricably linked, and to really address institutions, address the institutional bullying and trauma that was passed down through organizations like the army and the police, and, you know, really helping to undo this. And it was just such an extraordinary privilege to work with these guys and to learn from them. And what I really loved, it was just the focus on well-being and aliveness and joy and love. You know, so much of therapy is uncovering, unwrapping trauma and how terrible it is and all these terrible things that have happened to you in your life and all of the problems. And both what I got from Michael, who was an early student of Ivors, and how they both worked so closely together, it was like focusing on the joy. Where was the aliveness? Where was the love? Where is the joy in your life? Yeah, but all these problems go, but what gives you joy? What brings the aliveness in? And it stayed so deeply with me that it really has changed the whole way I work personally. Like, you know, yes, sure, we've carried this trauma with us, but what enlivens us, what lifts us up, what enlightens us, and bringing that the focus to that. And I just have just so much respect and really bow to these guys and all that we've got from them. And thanks, Martin. We're carrying this and passing it on, and these wonderful guys here now. And it's just so wonderful to see the next generation coming down the line with this. And hey, so well done, guys. This was a tremendous tribute. You really did Ivor well today. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Declan, and thank you for all the work done over the decades. And yeah, honouring this aliveness and crack and mischief that we have in Ireland, which is very unique, the kind of that Ivor really embodied. And let's not forget that, you know, the crack and the joy, like, absolutely, like you say. And also Michael Corrie, who I never really knew much about, but Martin mentioned him as well yesterday, how important a figure he was in Ireland, and thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought him in there, Declan, because you know, we talk about Ivor not being written out of history. I mean, Michael Corrie deserves a lot more recognition and respect than ever. I knew Michael very well. He was a good friend of mine, as he was yours, and an amazing, courageous man. And I would say about Michael Corrie that he was even more radical than Ivor was. And that's why they threw him out of the Eastern Health Board, because he wouldn't compromise. But he was an amazing man, and with Anya Tuberty, his partner, did beautiful work, and I'm glad we got the chance to honor him on this talk here today. Yeah,
absolutely. And their books are still out there, you know.
Yeah,
the books on depression and madness, and you know, they did leave a legacy in terms of their written work. Yeah, right. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Well, thanking everyone so much for attending today. There was 350 people interested in this webinar. We'll put it online. Really as a testament to Ivor and his work, to all those who knew him way better than I did, and to his family, thank you so much, honouring this really great man. And Martin, for your time today. It's been a privilege, and hopefully we can, in the best way we can, hold that flame that Ivor carried going forward.
And thank you, Rob, for having this idea to create this webinar to honour Ivor, because you know, as soon as I heard about it and you contacted me, I was delighted to jump on board. And, you know, I really mean it when I say that you're one of the people that I feel is going to carry the torch onwards with Ivor's legacy, from his generation to my generation to your generation and on from there. So thank you for taking this opportunity that we had here today. It was brilliant, beautifully done, and, you know, looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. We'll leave it there. Have a beautiful day, folks. Let's stay in our hearts in this crazy world.